The jury getting ready to decide the fate of music mogul Sean Diddy Combs. Deliberations are expected to get underway Monday in a sex trafficking and racketeering trial. Joining us now with some insight is ABC legal contributor Brain Buckmire. Brian has been there in the courtroom. Thank you for being here this morning, Brian.
Of course.
So we heard closing arguments last week. What were the main points that each side made?
So for the government, they're leaning heavily on Cassie Ventura's testimony, that powerful testimony about her being sex trafficked and also transported for the purpose of prostitution. And they have a very formulaic system of walking through the elements of the charges and also how the facts fit in. But for the defense, a big point of their argument is credibility. They're saying that this is a tale of two stories, the government's rendition of what happened and the actual facts. And they're trying to poke holes in the credibility of the witnesses and some of the statements to show that Sean Combs is not guilty of the charges he's accused of.
And you've been in court through all of these closing arguments here. What's Diddy's demeanor been like?
So it's interesting because I get to sit in the actual courtroom. I'm not just in the building itself, but when I step out to do a hit, for example, for ABC News Live, I come back into the overflow where there's an actual camera on him. So from one view, I'm seeing the back of his head, kind of like the side angle. He's leaned back, really attentive. He is scanning the jury, seeing different people's facial reaction. And you would think that he's confident. But when you go to the overflow room and you have a camera in front of him, you can see his legs shaking. You can see his hand going back and forth. Wow. And I would say this, it's probably not indicative of one thing or the other. I've sat in court holding the hand of my client as we wait for a verdict. It's very, very jarring to see 12 people decide your fate as you have another person trying to make the argument that you're innocent.
And the jury is expected to get this tomorrow. What is this process going to look like? How is this week going to go?
So you're probably going to hear something like the jury's going to get charged. And that's basically just the judge giving the instructions of explaining how the elements fit into this case, how you can adjust for the credibility or assess the credibility of a witness, and how they're supposed to deliberate, what they're supposed to consider and not consider. That will probably take about an hour or two on Monday morning, and then they'll go into the deliberation room. That's when you may or may not get some notes about what they want to hear, what they want to see. But until then, they're just going to sit and wait. We know Friday is July 4th. There's a day off, potentially Thursday as well. So Wednesday is the new Friday for next week. And, you know, Friday is typically indicative of a verdict.
All right. So, Brian, it was really interesting you describing how Diddy is in the courtroom. And I know that there was some reporting last week that he said to the judge, you know, I wanted to tell you you're doing a good job. What's at stake here when the jury returns a verdict?
So I think there are two big things here. Of course, we're talking about his liberty, incarceration, right? If he's found guilty of that RICO conspiracy, that's up to 15 years and up to life in prison. For the sex trafficking, each one of those 20 years, and the transportation to engage in prostitution, 10 years each. Now, because of the nature of these charges, we're talking about consecutive charges, not necessarily concurrent. So think like 20 and 10. Life in 20 could be a lot. But a big part of this, if someone's found guilty of a RICO conspiracy, they don't just try to incarcerate the person. They try to dismantle that RICO financially. So every one of his businesses, all the homes, everything financially that we heard about through the trial, the government could take that if found guilty of RICO.
What do you think? Do you think a split verdict here? A lot of people have been talking about this.
I know every time you get a contributor on who's legal, you're like, what's it going to be? What's it going to be?
Take that crystal ball out.
Yes.
If I had the crystal ball and I knew what jurors think, trust me, I'd be a much more successful defense attorney. But in my opinion, I think there could be a bit of a split on that RICO, that criminal enterprise. I think Mark Nicola did a pretty good job of saying the predicate acts, the arson, the kidnapping, yeah, they could be there, but is this actually a criminal enterprise? I think it could be split there. Cassie, very powerful witness. I think he could be found guilty of that. Jane, some issues there. And I think the transportation to engage in prostitution, absolutely. If you do all the math, you put that together, I think he's looking at 15, 20, 25 years, depending on how that all falls out and how the mitigation and aggravating factors apply to his sentencing.
We know you'll be following it this week.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Brian, for being here to break that all down and for breaking out the crystal ball for us, too.